So we had this spare mattress that we wanted to be able to use for guest space, and I didn't want to have a bed in the way all the time, so I decided to make a Murphy bed. I used a hardware kit from Rockler, and for the record, I did pay for this. It is not a promotion, but I will put a link in the description for anyone that's interested. Per the plans that are included in the kit, this takes 5 full sheets of plywood to make, and this time I'm not using cheap plywood. I got some really nice 9-ply stuff. So my Murphy bed includes 3 main elements. There's the big centerpiece that actually holds the mattress and bed itself. Then there's these 2 side towers. The plans that are included in the kit only tell you how to make the center part, and that's what takes the 5 sheets of plywood, but I had enough scrap left over from that to be able to build those 2 side towers. All the dimensions are included in the instructions, but I did do some pre-planning to optimize all my cuts and minimize waste. Having a track saw is definitely nice to be able to do this, but the entire project could be done with nothing more than a circular saw and a drill. For the large center portion at least, I took extra care to make sure I got everything cut exactly to the right size. If anything was off, it would be pretty hard to make sure that the bed frame would still properly fit inside this box when it was all done. There were a few dimensions that I cut slightly oversized with the track saw and then got them to final dimension on the table saw. So this blue and black and plastic thing that you see on the left hand side of the screen and over the table saw blade is a 3rd arm attachment for the dust collector. I've been getting these things advertised to me, and I'm pretty dubious as to how useful they are. I wanted to try one out, but I didn't want to spend $275 to do it, so I 3D printed this one up. The jury's still out as to whether or not it's useful. I can say for the application I'm showing right here, it was not useful at all. I may make a video specifically on this in the future, but for right now I'm kind of leaning towards these things are gimmicks in almost all applications. Making it was a fun project though, because I got a lot better at 3D modeling. The bed frame itself attaches to 2 brackets that are bolted to the main box. The brackets themselves have little saddles that the bed frame rides in, and then there's a gas strut that connects both pieces on each side. Threaded inserts go in very precisely drilled locations. So right here I thought I was being super clever and 3D printed this little stop collet to put on the drill bit to make sure that all my holes were drilled to the right depth. This was a dumb idea because it slid up on the drill bit a little bit through use, and as you'll see in some of the later holes, it's being held in place with masking tape, which is what I should have just used in the first place. The kit came with all the hardware that was needed with the exception of screws that are used to actually hold this box together. You install the threaded inserts using an Allen key, and I like to add a little bit of super glue to the threads to help prevent them from backing out. So this right here is how you're supposed to do it, but I find it's kind of hard to get these started in the wood doing it this way, so I have another method. This is way faster and easier, you just got to make sure you don't over tighten it. Per the instructions, the bed box itself is held together with screws and dowels. Not everybody has a domino joiner, but I do, and this made it go a lot faster. So that being said, of course you could do this with dowels. It would just take a little bit longer to lay everything out and drill all the individual holes. Most of the strength in this construction is being provided by the dominoes and glue. Even so, screws are still very necessary to be able to provide the compression forces to close these joints up. I was able to use clamps on some of them, but for the side pieces to go on, I definitely had to resort to just using the screws. The further I got in assembly on this, the more difficult it became to actually work on. I cut some very thin strips of poplar to use as edge banding. These will go on any exposed plywood edges. Even though this whole bed is going to get painted, this will go a long way to making those edges look a lot smoother. You can buy iron-on edge banding that goes on a lot quicker and easier than this, but I decided I wanted to have something that would probably be a little bit more durable and well attached. After I had glued all the banding on, I still needed to trim it flush. I opted to do that with the trim router, and to minimize dust, I made this little 3D printed shroud assembly. It worked pretty well, but I did find it kind of awkward to use. I covered all the screw heads and any other imperfections with some lightweight automotive body filler. If your project's going to be painted, this is really the way to go. Per the plans, 2 large pieces of plywood go on the bottom of the bed frame to kind of create the appearance of doors when the bed is closed up. I didn't really want the look of just a flat piece of plywood, so I cut some very thin strips of poplar to dress them up a bit. I wanted to create the appearance of bifold doors, so this would look more like a wardrobe and not a bed. These little thin strips of wood were glued and pin nailed down. I wanted them to look like they were the rails and stiles for some paneled doors. To effect that, I left a little gap between each side where there would be a hinge if this was actually a bifold door. These pin nail holes were so small that I just used some wood filler instead of messing around with Bondo. After I finished with those panels, I decided to assemble the bed frame itself so I could get a good idea of how high up off the floor the mattress would be. If you watch closely, you'll see I leave some of the mattress support slats out, and this is per the instructions. It's to facilitate installing some screws at a later step. So like I mentioned earlier, the 2 side towers are made entirely with the offcuts that were left over after I made the big center part. These 2 towers are essentially mirror images of each other, and both of them are going to have a single drawer, a little cabinet at the bottom, and then LED lights on all the shelves. The side towers themselves are almost exclusively held together with glue and dominoes. Before I got much further, I had to cut the dados for the LED lights themselves to actually go into. After that, it was back to cutting slots for dominoes. Usually when I'm making shelves, I'll cut dados for the shelves to go into, but because these are so small, I thought I would try doing it with dominoes. Like the joinery on the middle bed box, this could be done with dowels as well. Anyway, it can be kind of tricky to get dominoes in the correct position when it's on an entirely flat plane, so I whipped up this little jigging method to be able to make sure they were all in the exact same spots and straight. The straight edge that's clamped to the board is pretty much just there to make sure that the domino cutter is always in the exact same spot relative to the line that I'm cutting the slots on. If that's lined up properly, it's as easy as just moving the machine to make sure it's lined up on the center of where each domino needs to go. Each tower does have one small crosspiece that's held in with pocket screws. I added holes for shelf pins inside the little cabinets, but I don't think that I'll ever actually make a shelf to go in there. The space just really isn't that big. All of the interior surfaces were sanded to 220 prior to assembly. As with the center bed box, all the raw plywood edges were trimmed out with poplar. I got way extra at this point and decided to fill in the pocket hole screws with more of the body filler. This was kind of a dumb waste of time because it's pretty hard to ever see those holes when this is all put together. The doors and drawer faces got the same sort of treatment that I used for those big panels earlier. Next, I drilled the holes for the hinges, while apparently leaving the light for the drill press right in the way of the camera. So as it turns out, the hinges that I bought, which are labeled as inset frameless hinges, were actually overlay hinges. So this door will not fit in this opening with these hinges. It's always going to hit. So I thought I could reposition these a little bit to make them work, but it turns out I can't. So these holes are in the wrong spot and I'm going to have to fill them in. So I'm glad I didn't waste my time making an actual paneled door. I'm glad this is getting painted. Anyway, I just flipped the doors over and re-drilled the holes in the correct position for my new hinges on the other side. I also installed little stop blocks so the doors wouldn't close too far. The drawers themselves are pretty basic and they're made out of solid poplar. I milled up some more of the rough cut stock that I had and then cut all the pieces to length. Since all the stock was milled to be a 1/2 inch thick, I used a 1/2 inch rabbet bit on the router table. I cut a groove in each piece to receive the hardboard bottoms. So I accidentally made these drawers kind of backwards. Ideally the rabbeted pieces would be on the sides rather than the front and back. This is so you can rely on the sheer strength of the nails to help prevent pulling the drawers apart through frequent openings. Since these drawers are so small and aren't ever going to be full of anything heavy like they might be in a kitchen, I don't think it'll be a problem. As I may have mentioned earlier, each of the side towers are going to feature LED lights on all the shelves, and I needed to do something now to make sure all the wires and the switch would be hidden. This little recess I'm cutting here is actually for the switch, which is a little bit deeper than the 3/4 inch thick plywood will allow. I'll show you how I deal with that in a few moments, but right now I'm routing in a channel which will allow all the wires that get the power to the individual strips to be hidden. These channels will allow the wires to go from the bottoms of these two side towers into the center unit. There's an accessible wall outlet there, and I'm going to use that to power the lights. Incidentally, these grooves are on the sides of the towers that face inward towards the center bed box unit, so all this stuff will be hidden. Right now I'm drilling the holes where the wires will go into the center bed box. I didn't want to blow out the veneer on the inside of the bed box, so I started the hole with a big Forstner bit and then finished it with a top bearing flush trim. Likewise, I used a flush trim bit with these little guides that I just held on with some double-sided tape to make the recess for that switch so it would be able to push it all the way up against this bed box. Yeah, this was done with me sitting on a ladder and the bed box on its side. At this point there were no other major parts to make except for a bit of a crown to go on the top of the centerpiece. I used a basic crown molding jig for my compound miters. This was sort of an afterthought, but I cut a hole in the lower headboard to be able to access the wall outlet that's going to be behind this thing. So I primed everything, and this right here was not necessary and actually created more work in the end. To be honest, the entire painting process of this bed was a huge pain in the butt, and I wish I had not done it this way. Aside from not using this primer, I would not have used General Finish's milk paint because it took 4 coats to cover this primer up, and if you looked at it, it left marks on the paint. The can said no top coat would be needed except for really high wear items like kitchen tables, but I can tell you that is patently not true. I'm actually getting mad just thinking about it right now. Anyway, I ended up top coating the entire thing with water-based polyurethane, just like I did those drawers. I've detailed installing LED lights in a few other videos, so I'll put links to those in the description. This right here is kind of an overview. Right now, I'm cutting the aluminum tracks that the LEDs go in themselves. That little recess I just cut is actually to create a little bit more space for the LED connector, and I will apologize for the quality of my voice. The allergies this year are kicking my butt. Anyway, I found that the connectors don't quite fit inside the channel between that and the diffuser unless you cut that little slot for it to go into. I roughed up the backs of those channels and then used a little bit of Gorilla Glue to glue it into the cabinets themselves, and right here you just don't want to use too much because it does foam and expand. I weighted it down just a little bit to make sure that it didn't move out of place as that glue expands. This is the wire that's going to connect everything together, and I'll put links in the description for the electrical components that go into this build. Anyway, I stripped the ends off the wires and then tinned them with solder because that works a lot better to get them into those LED connectors. Here's the connector that is used to actually attach the wires to the LED strips themselves. The strip has a cut line on it about every 2 inches or so, so you just cut it there, then put it on one end of the connector and then the wires on the other, but make sure that the positive and negatives are in the right spot, otherwise it won't work. If you wire everything up and the lights don't come on, it's probably either a short, the connections are loose, or you crossed a connection between positive and negative somewhere. Anyway, I'm trying to build a fairly neat wiring harness, so I'm holding all the wires together with little pieces of heat shrink tubing. This helps hold everything in place, and it also adds a little bit of protection to the wire insulation in the areas where I'm going to secure the harness down with some hot glue. All the wires got twisted and then soldered together, and then I covered those connections up with more heat shrink tubing. Incidentally, these are all low voltage LEDs. They produce very little heat, and the wires only have 12 volts going through them. I always like to do an ops check before I get too far. I waited until I knew everything was correctly connected before I did the final solder and finished off those wire connections. A little bit of hot glue holds everything in place, but I could have just as easily used a piece of masking tape. The last thing I did was peel off the adhesive backing, stick the lights down into the channels, and then cut the diffusers and install them. I wanted to add a little bit of padding to the top part of the lower headboard. This could have been done better, but I'm not really an upholsterer, and I was mostly just trying to use up some supplies that I had left over from previous projects. A piece of batting between the foam and this faux leather that I'm wrapping it in would have gone a long way to smoothing all of this out. Anyway, that doesn't really matter because once the mattress was in place, it turned out you couldn't hardly even see this at all. I 3D printed a little trim piece to go in that spot where I cut the hole for the power outlet. For the backs for the 2 side towers, I cut some pieces of hardboard and then coated those in contact cement. I apparently forgot to hit record, but then I put some spray adhesive on the back of some more faux leather and then stuck that down. Here I am cutting it flush. These panels then got stapled onto the back of the side towers. Next I put on the drawer faces, and I got those lined up properly with some double-sided tape to keep everything in place, and then I finished it off with some screws. Here's the space in my office where the bed's going to be going, and before I put it in I need to remove the baseboard where it's going to go. I moved in the first side tower to make sure it was in the right spot, and then I moved in the big centerpiece. I didn't film a lot of what happened next because I needed to focus on the install, but I'll go over it now. Alright, I got a little lazy about filming because I hurt my back while carrying in one of these pieces, and then I was traveling for spring break, so I'm going to get you caught up on what has been done so far. The main center part that holds the mattress is attached to the wall in several places. So there are these brackets that have lag screws going into the studs, and this little screw right here pretty much just holds this bracket down, but there is actually a metal pin that goes into a hole that is drilled into the top of the cabinet. Then this threaded part that's coming up through here is actually a pan-headed bolt that is coming up from the bottom. And then as you can see, there are 3 of these brackets on the top. Like I said, each going into studs. Below that, in the upper headboard, are 3 more lag bolts going into the studs. And down at the bottom, and this is hard to see, there's actually 3 more bolts going into the wall. So there are a total of 12 lag bolts holding this cabinet up to the wall. Down here, you can also see I've got the wires coming in from each of the side pieces for the lights that are in them, and they come together and are just plugged into a power strip that's plugged into that wall outlet. The other 2 cords you might see going to that power strip are for some reading lights that are recessed into the wall, and they just pop on when you open them up. I'm just running the cord behind the sheetrock and coming out the hole down there and then plugging them in. And I just did that to keep it as neat as possible. And the reason I picked these reading lights is because how flush they will sit against the wall when they're closed up. So when the mattress is in and the bed is up against the wall, there will be plenty of clearance and not bump into those. Here you can see the lights turned on each of the side shelf units, the small cabinet and drawer at the bottom. And those little cabinets should be big enough to be able to hold the bedding for when this is all closed up. The side cabinets themselves are attached to the center bed box through several screws that go right in from the center bed box itself into those cabinets. Right now, I've got the bed frame itself installed with the gas struts holding it up. There is a lot of pressure or tension, I guess, that makes this want to come back up. So until the mattress and the front panels are on it, it's going to be very hard to keep it down. There's lots of warnings in the instructions about having an adult sitting on it while you're doing some of the next couple steps. Right now, the next step is to put in the upper stop so that when this comes up, it doesn't go too far into the cabinet. Because right now, as you can see, it goes in further than it needs to, and so the outer panels will never be truly vertical until that upper stop is put in. Okay, so right now I need to get the actual metal bed frame part perfectly vertical. So I've got this 4-foot level clamped to it so I can watch the bubble to see when it comes out. But there's so much tension on this right now, I need a way to hold it out while I screw in the end stop. So what I did was I flipped around the handle on one of these quick grip clamps, and I'm putting a little pad on here just so it doesn't scratch up the upper headboard too much. But I'm just gonna stick it in there and pump it out slowly till I get that right where it needs to be. So I put it a little bit to the side so I'm able to fit that upper stop in there. And as I pump this out, the bubble gets closer to center in the level. And right there looks just about perfect to me. So here I've got my upper stop. I've got some screws already started in there. It's just a little mark. It's probably hard to see where the center is. I'm gonna eyeball it once it's up there, but all I'm gonna do is press it flush against the frame and screw it in. And that's the upper stop installed.
The door panels themselves get these little brackets screwed onto them in precise locations. This is so you can clip them onto the bed frame itself before you get them properly positioned and put the final screws in. Maybe my plywood was just really heavy, but I found at this point that the bed stayed down on its own pretty well just with the door panels, though I did use a couple of disc weights to make sure. The last thing that goes on are these little brackets that make sure that the mattress won't fall down inside the bed. The mattress I'm putting on is a pretty heavy memory foam mattress, and I found I didn't have any problems getting it up and down, but I don't think this is something you'd want to do like every day.
And in case you are wondering, the bed does not contact the cords when it's moving, and as you can see, everything is still accessible when the bed is down. The last step was putting in a tiny little trim piece to cover up this edge. So there you have it, that is 100% done. With the addition of this Murphy bed, my office/guest room space is pretty much complete. This took me about 3 weeks to make in my free time, and aside from the sheer size of that middle piece, it was a pretty easy build. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful or at least entertaining, and as always, if you made it this far, thanks for watching.